I invite you to take your Bible and turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians 7. We began a study of 1 Corinthians, a series of studies sometime back, and I appreciate your patience. For various reasons, it has not gone quickly, but I do thank you for your interest in it, and I appreciate your willingness to hang in there with me. I thought from the beginning that we would not try to present an exhaustive study, and I'm sure that I haven't, but maybe we can make some more progress as we go along. But it's an important work. 1 Corinthians is a passage that has, I don't know, a half a dozen or more passages that are considered to be controversial. And so we said early on we weren't speaking for the church in all these things. I was speaking for myself. But I'm speaking in such a way as I hope you will give your careful attention, and then you'll have to make up your mind what this book is talking about and what's being said. And 1 Corinthians 7 is a passage like that. It's a passage that has been differently understood among religious people and among brethren. But I believe that its message is very important and needs to be clearly presented and clearly taken. So in the beginning of this chapter, we'll just do a brief review because it has been quite a while since we were here before, and we'll try to finish up our study tonight on this chapter. He begins with the expression, "Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me." In the old translation, that's the way he says it, and we find that refrain running through this last part of the book. And I think we can safely take that to mean these are things that the Corinthians had written to Paul about, and he's addressing their questions, their concerns, these various subjects that have been maybe suggested by them. And so in this passage, we're going to be talking about things that relate to really this question: will my marriage help or hinder my serving Christ? And so he deals with several specifics along this line. He talks about and talks to some of the unmarried. He talks to the married. He talks to those who might be married to unbelievers, and even those who may have virgin daughters that would be under the responsibility of a father. And so how is it that we might handle those matters? How does all of this relate to my service to Christ? I think honest questions on the part of these brethren. How will my marriage state affect my relationship with God and my service to God? So he begins in this first section, and we've looked at this recently, so we'll just touch on it briefly. "Now concerning the things whereof you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and every woman have her own husband. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise the wife also unto the husband. The wife hath not power over her own body, but the husband, and likewise the husband hath not power over his own body, but the wife. Defraud ye not the one to the other, except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, lest Satan tempt you for your incontinency. I speak this by permission and not of commandment. For I would that all men were even as myself." Paul speaks as a bachelor, of course. "But every man hath his proper gift of God, the one after this manner, another after that. I say therefore to the unmarried and the widows that it would be good for them to abide even as I. But if they cannot contain, let them marry. It is better to marry than to burn." Here's a good way. The good way is I want you to be like me and to not be distracted by a family, but just be focused on your service to God. A man that does that does well. He explains as he goes on why that's so and the reasons for that particular admonition at this particular time. But he also makes it plain in this context. He's not forbidding people to marry. He's not commanding people not to marry, because he points out that marriage is a gift of God. It's a blessing, and it's particularly important to some people. So what he says in this command is that it is clear enough that if a person is going to marry, it must be a monogamous relationship, that a man is to have his own wife and a wife to have her own husband. So God had tolerated polygamy through the years, but that clearly is not his intention from the beginning, and it's not acceptable under the law of Christ. In such a relationship, there ought to be a consideration for one another. Due benevolence, an expression euphemistically used of conjugal duty, as one fellow put it, and that's right. So sex within marriage is holy. It's not something that is intended to be looked at as dirty or something that is to be shameful. It has its place in life, but only within the marriage relationship. And husbands and wives, as one translation puts it rather plainly, should be fair with each other about having sex. And that is true. And so to avoid fornication. Marriage is a good thing for a lot of reasons, this included. And it is to be recognized as really a relationship in which a husband and a wife are thoughtful of each other and their needs. The wife does not have authority over her own body, neither the husband authority over his body. And there ought not to be, as he says, the withholding of yourselves from each other unless you agree for a time and for good reason, because Satan will tempt you through a lack of self-control. He said, I speak this by permission and not commandment. Again, this is his divine, I believe, advice. But he's not giving here a law saying do not marry. In fact, he says in some cases it may be better to marry. It is better to marry than to burn. And I think that's clear enough. Paul is, again, not against marriage. Marriage is honorable in all. The Proverbs taught us that a man that finds a wife finds a good thing. And Paul would consider in the category of apostasy and the false teacher one who would come condemning marriage as a whole. It is a gift of God. But he says, for the present distress, that's an expression that he uses in this context. In verse 26, that's the language in the old translation. Therefore, it is good for the present distress. It is good for a man to be so as I am. That word there, distress, is a word that's found, I think, about 19 times in the New Testament. It's a word which suggests the idea of that which has a compelling force to it. Look over in Luke chapter 21. It's found here in Luke 21 when he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. He talks about, in verse 23, woe to them that are with child, nursing in those days, there shall be great distress in the land. Well, if you look up earlier in the context, he's talking there about the armies compassing Jerusalem. So I think we get an idea of how strong this expression is, distress. And so he doesn't specify what it is, but there's some type of, it seems, exterior pressure that will be placed upon Christians. This is clearly in his focus. And he's saying there that when that time comes, it's going to be easier for you to do right if you're by yourself than if you are caring for a family. So for a very specific reason, he encourages people to abide even as he. But even in that case, he says, I'm not forbidding marriage. I'm suggesting it will be easier for you to do the right thing. Why may marriage make it tougher? We'll talk about this maybe more. Maybe we'll just mention it now. But in verse 32, he says, I would have you without carefulness. Or as maybe your translation, I would not have you to be anxious. This is back in our text now in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 32. He that is unmarried cares for the things that belong to the Lord, that he may please the Lord. He that is married cares for the things that are of the world, that he may please his wife. In this context, he had said, back in verse 28, if you marry, you've not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. I would that you would be spared this trouble. What are you talking about? Look in verse 29. This I say, brethren, that the time is short. It remains that both they that have wives be as though they had none, and they that weep as though they that wept not, and they that rejoice as though they that rejoice not, and they that buy as though they possess not, and they that use this world as not abusing it. For the fashion of this world passes away. What does he mean by that? For example, in verse 29, those that have wives be as though they had none. I think what he's saying there is that when the trial that I'm talking about comes and you face the full force of it, you're going to have to act, and you're going to have to make the decision to serve God as a married man, as if you were not married. What do you mean by that? I mean, to put it this way, if someone were to threaten your life and to say, you must renounce Jesus or I will take your life, well, I think we might work up the courage to say, well, all right, what is my life? Anyway, I will not renounce Jesus no matter what you do to me. But what about a family man? And instead of threatening your life, they threaten the life of your family. Everybody in this room understands now we've ramped things up. That's a whole different kind of temptation. Tough enough to give your life, but to give the life of your family. You know what the Lord would say? If you love anybody more than me, you're not worthy of me. You do what's right regardless. Now, Paul said, that's a pressure that I'm trying to spare you from. And that's a very real danger. Because there's going to be a time, there may be a time in the near future, when you may face a pressure that will cause you to have to act like somebody who's not married, as if you didn't have a family, to have that same kind of commitment. And those of you who weep as though you wept not, the things that you're concerned about now, they're not going to concern you then. And those that rejoice as though they rejoice not. This will be a trial that will overshadow every concern that you now have. Those that use the world as not abusing it. I like what one translation says there. Those that use the world as though they had no dealings with the world. They were not occupied with the world. All the things in this world that consume us at this moment, all of us can relate to that. Everybody's got, they're concerned about the power bill going up 10 times. They're concerned about insurance getting paid this month. All those things. Let me tell you, you're going to be facing a trial here that may cause you to have to forget all of that. And the less you have to forget, the easier it'll be to forget it. I think that's what he's saying here. For the present distress and because of the distracting nature of this world, I would like your life to be as simple as possible so that you can focus on the one thing that matters, and that is facing this trial and coming out on the other side a friend of Jesus. That, I think, is what he's talking about in this section. But he says this, that while that trial may or may not hit you, what may hit you is burning in lust. And he said if that lust leads you to sin, then you've lost the battle on that end. So it's better to marry than to burn. But best of all, because of the present distress, that you might live your life simply, streamlined, and with only Jesus in focus. Lust is a problem. And as we looked at from Matthew chapter 5, whoever looks on a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. When Paul writes, and he does often in the epistles, about the danger, not just of sexual immorality, but impurity and shameful passion and evil desire. Because of these things, the wrath of God comes. That's a big problem. So when he writes about better to marry than to burn, we might think he's talking about the fire of hell. Maybe they're related. But I think primarily he's talking about the fire of desire, evil desire, unlawful desire that can lead us away from God. So, to the unmarried, for these reasons, I say best not to, if you can. Now, to the married, what if you're already married? Paul, do you think we'll just get rid of our wives because after all you said it'd be easier if we weren't married? No, you can't do that once you've made the vow. To the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Didn't the Lord tell you this? Let not the wife depart from her husband. But if she depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. That word depart is a word that can be translated here divorce. And so here's a woman who departs from, divorces the wife. A man divorces his wife, I should say. The wife divorces her husband. It applies both ways. And the words of the Lord that Paul's referring to there, we know. Matthew chapter 19 records one of the occasions when the Lord was asked, is it lawful to put away or divorce your wife for just any reason? Jesus said, have you never read that he which made them at the beginning, made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. What God joined together, let not man put asunder. You have a lawful marriage, you must not put that asunder. If you do, it's sin. Whatever else happens, if you do that, it's sin. It's a sin in that case to divorce. They said, well, what about Moses? Moses, for the hardness of your heart, suffered you to put away your wives. From the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, that whoever puts away or divorces his wife, unless it's for fornication, and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her that's put away commits adultery. Here's one exception to the law. What's the rule? Do not put asunder what God joined together. But you may, for the cause of fornication, put asunder. And in that case, you may marry another. But only in that case. Matthew 5 puts another interesting light on the situation. Here Jesus is talking about the contrast between the old and the new law, in particular their perception of the old law. It hath been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But I say to you, whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery. We've said before, that's not the way we would expect that to read. I would expect it to say, whoever puts away his wife and marries another commits adultery. That's true. Matthew 19 says that. Mark 10 says that. But this passage says, if a man puts away his wife, I don't know why he put her away. It wasn't for her adultery. It might not have been any fault of hers. She may have been the purest woman you've ever met. But he puts her away unjustly. What does Jesus say? He, the man divorcing, causes her, the woman wrongly put away, to commit adultery. How do you make sense of that? Well, there are certain things necessarily inferred here. We know from the idea of adultery that it must have been this woman took up with somebody else. Sexual sin. But she had no right to. God's going to blame her for that. I tell you who else he's going to blame. He's going to blame me for that if I'm the one who put her away. A man who puts away his wife unjustly not only has sinned in that regard, but he may be responsible for her committing adultery with somebody else. He's put her in that vulnerable position, and when she fails, God blames her, God blames me also. That's relevant to what we're talking about here. Luke 16 puts it this way. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her that's divorced from her husband commits adultery. In this case, we have sin in abundance, tragic situation. A man wrongly, sinfully decided to put away his wife unjustly. Sin. Now she goes and marries another. She's in sin, and that man's responsible for that. And then the one that she took up with in this second marriage, likewise, Jesus said, is in adultery. What a mess. And it happens every single day. And you can get that done for $400 if you believe the billboards. $400 and eternity in hell. Can't beat that. And you'll find a preacher on nearly every corner tell you, that's fine, don't worry about it. But you got the same Bible I've got, and you know better. It's heartbreaking, horrible. And we run into these folks in the community, we're trying to teach them the gospel, and they've made just a mess of this thing, and they don't want to even think about trying to deal with this and repent of this, and they just find somebody to tell them what they want to hear. So, here's the relevance to our passage. When Paul said, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled, he clearly wasn't saying, now, once a woman's been put away unjustly, you can either remain unmarried or you can be reconciled to somebody. But you know, it's either one, whatever's easiest. No, that's not the case. He does use the word or there, but these are not two equal choices. If a man has unjustly put away his spouse, he has an obligation to try to fix that thing. He has an obligation to try to right the wrong that he's committed, to try to save her from being married another and committing adultery and spreading that sin. Clearly that's the case. You can't read this verse and read Matthew 5 and think Jesus is saying, well, you can put away a lawful spouse for an unjust reason and just live with that. If you can fix it, you have to. But why does he put the or in there? The obvious reason, reconciliation is more than just his choice. It takes two. And what if that woman he put away unjustly doesn't want him back, won't take him back, won't reconcile with him? Well, in that case, he's going to have to remain unmarried. But surely we understand, I think, when he says remain unmarried or be reconciled, in the context of what the New Testament teaches, they're not just two equal choices and you just choose which one you want. This is deadly serious business. And Paul does not in any way diminish that by what he says in this passage. Let me hurry on to verse 12, because this is, I think, about where we left off last time. In chapter 7, verse 12, he continues this discussion about marriage and how that affects our relationship with God. And we've been talking about folks married. The assumption is married to other Christians. But what about if you're married to somebody who's not a Christian? Paul, should we divorce our wife who's not a Christian? Would that make it easier for us to go to heaven? Would that please God? Would we be better off doing that? Paul said in verse 12, I think I've got it on the chart up here actually. To the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother that hath a wife believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which hath a husband that believeth not, if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. Let me pause to make this point. Sometimes people have said, well, you know, he said there, this is what he says and not the Lord. Well, obviously that's true. But I think we press it too far to think that this is now a separate law that has no connection with Matthew 19. I think what Paul says here is, let me address this specific question. Jesus did not specifically address the idea to his Jewish audience of marrying unbelievers. That probably wasn't as much of a problem. But now Paul specifically addresses the question. But I would make this point with you, and as you read this verse again, please notice that actually, while this is a specific application of the marriage law, it comes out at the same place. There's not one thing in this passage that differs from what Jesus said in Matthew 19. It may be a more specific application of it, but it's the same. What is the answer? Well, he says, don't leave. That's what the Lord said. Don't leave. Don't put asunder what God joined together. And he wants to specifically make the point, yes, God did join these folks together. Verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now they are holy. What in the world does he mean, sanctified? I don't know what your translation may say. That's the old translation, sanctified. It goes back to a word that we may be familiar with, hagios, which is the word for holy. It's the same word for holy. the root of it is in the last part of the verse. It's set apart with the idea of being unclean. Clearly, he's not talking here about remission of sins. It makes no sense to have Paul saying, now, you have two ways of finding remission of sins. You can either repent of your sins and in faith in Christ be baptized for remission of sins, or you can marry a Christian. Either one, and you'll be forgiven. No. I think in the context of marriage, we have to think about the word holy in its root meaning, set apart. That to say somebody is holy may mean they're set apart for God. But I think in this case what it means is they are set apart to their spouse. In other words, it's a legitimate marriage. And God makes that point very clear here. That if a person, a Christian, and I don't know how they got there. I don't know how it was that these Christians found themselves married to non-Christians. It may have been that they both were non-Christians when they married, and then one of them has found the gospel. I don't know. But however they got there, I think the point that Paul would make is the marriage is recognized by God as legitimate, and your vows he holds you to. And your children are not, for lack of a better term, and I hate this term, illegitimate. But, that's a term there. The idea is your children are a part of the marriage and the fruit of the marriage. You don't consider your children illegitimate. Don't consider your spouse illegitimate. God holds you to the vow that you made, even though you now have this vow for one who is not a Christian. So don't you leave. Don't feel the liberty, much less the obligation, to put that partner away because they're not a Christian. That's not your right. What about if it turns around? What if they depart? What if they leave? And that's where we come into verse 15. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? Let me try to filter through some of this material here. I think we've already talked about that for the most part. Specific application, the same message, do not divorce. But what does he mean when he talks about not under bondage? If they leave, you're not under bondage. Well, there are some folks, and including not a few brethren, who think we have here a separate marriage law. This chart somebody put together says God designed marriage for life. However, there are two exceptions as an option of divorce. Matthew 19:9, you put away your spouse for fornication, and then 1 Corinthians 7 is the, what do they call it, the Pauline exception? Pauline permission. We've got a whole different law now that says if you're married to a non-Christian and they leave, then you're free to marry again. Well, I've known some smart folks who taught that. I do not believe the Bible teaches that. I don't believe we can find that in this text. In the first place, you note that there is no reference in this passage to remarriage. You'd think there was, the way some folks talk about it. Paul gave the right to remarry to the folks who were abandoned by their unbelieving spouse. Where did he give that right? There's no mention of remarriage in the passage at all. I think it comes from, perhaps, an assumption that's made from that expression, bondage. And they say, well, the marriage bond is destroyed. The marriage bond is taken away, so they're unbound. If the unbelieving partner leaves, then they're unbound, and now they can get another one. Well, there's several problems with that. One of the problems is that the word bond here is not the word for the marriage bond. I'm not trying to play Greek scholar, and I think you have to be. But it's just a fact that the word here, he does talk about the marriage bond in this chapter. He talks about it there at the end, doesn't he? In verse 39 of chapter 7, that the wife is bound by the law to her husband, so long as that's the word for the marriage bond. But that's not the word in verse 15. That's just a fact. The word in verse 15 is a word which really suggests the idea of reduced to slavery. It's a word that's used of the slavery of the Israelites in Egypt. And it seems to me that what Paul is saying here is not that if your spouse leaves you, the unbelieving spouse, that you're free from the marriage bond. But what you are free from is a slavish service that won't take no for an answer. You're not obligated by God. You're not encouraged by God to force yourself or try to force yourself on anybody. Here's a case that might come up. A person might convince themselves under the duress of the moment that even if they leave, I've got to force myself on them. I will not let them go. Maybe if I do that, somehow they'll come back to me and come to Christ. And Paul said, you have no idea whether a person is going to obey or not. You can't force that. You can't make them come back. You're not called to make them come back. You're called to peace. If they're grown-up folks and they decide to leave, you can't force them to stay, and you're not under obligation to force them to stay. But that's 100 miles from saying, now you're free to get another partner, which I don't find in this passage or any other that I've read. And so, Paul, when you come down to it, comes out at the same place. What about those who are married to Christians? You ought to continue to keep your marriage vows. Don't break them. Don't put them away. When it comes to those who are married non-Christians, do not put them away. But in neither case, if a person sins by putting away their spouse, are they given the right to marry again? What they ought to do is reconcile. If that's not possible, God has called us to peace. Remain unmarried. But there is not a Pauline exception that differs from what the Lord taught in terms of its outcome. Let me go to verse 17 now. And notice with you, an interesting point that Paul makes in this context. Verse 17, as God has distributed to every man, this is the old translation, as the Lord hath called every one, so let him walk, and so I ordain in all churches. Is any man called being circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Is any called in uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but the keeping of the commandments of God. Let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Art thou called being a servant? Care not for it. If thou mayest be free, use it rather. For he that is called in the Lord being a servant is the Lord's freeman. And likewise also he that is called being free is Christ's servant. You're bought with a price. Be not ye the servants of men. Brethren, let every man abide wherein he is called. Let me read that again, verse 24. Brethren, let every man wherein he is called, therein abide with God. I like that expression when he talks about abiding in the same calling wherein he is called. I'm sorry to say that has been abused by some people. Teachers who have decided, well, what that means is, whatever marriage situation you're in, you may be with a woman, it may be your fourth wife and her fifth husband. But when you come to Christ, you see, abide in the calling when you were called. You just stay in that marriage, and that's not what Paul was saying at all. Paul is certainly not advocating anyone or excusing anyone staying in a relationship God would define as sinful. He's not saying abide in sin. We know better than that. Romans chapter 6. He said, can we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. Later on in that same chapter, in verse 13, you must not surrender any part of yourselves to sin. Surrender your whole being, he says, to him to be used for righteous purposes. We've got to, as he wrote to the Colossians, put to death sexual immorality, impurity. I've often thought How far does that idea extend? Just abide in the same calling. What if a fellow finds the gospel and he's a car thief for a living? You reckon he can abide in that calling? Or what about if he's in a homosexual relationship? I haven't found any brethren yet who would say, well, he can just abide in that calling. That's where he was when the gospel found him, so he can. Well, we know better than that. Not everybody does. Because I've heard intelligent folks make that argument. What he's saying instead is, we can serve God in whatever station of life we're in. That gets back to the original question I think that they were ultimately asking. They were asking the apostle, look, I'm not married. Can I serve God? Can I please God? Yes. Well, I'm married. Can I? Yes. I'm married to a non-Christian. Yes. You can serve God in any lawful relationship, any lawful state that you find yourself in. You got to get out of sin. But you can serve God where you are. You don't have to be Jewish to serve God. That's the point he makes, isn't it? Tell you something else, you don't have to be a Gentile to serve God. You don't have to be married to serve God. You don't have to be single to serve God. Now think about how that applies to us. That we can serve God where, in this sense, where we are. You don't have to be rich to serve God. You don't have to be powerful to serve God. And I'll tell you something, you don't have to be poor to serve God either. And you don't have to be educated to serve God. You don't have to be free to serve God. Think about that. I think that's a part of what he talks about here. Here I am, and I'm a slave. And the Lord would say, serve him as a slave. If you can be free, be free. But if you're a slave your whole life, serve God as a slave. Now, I tell you, that may seem foreign to us. And I have no idea about the future. But, that may have relevance to us one day. If somebody comes over here and knocks over this government and says, okay, you people line up. Now, you work in the salt mine. You can serve God from the salt mines. We won't like it. We can do it. A lot of folks have. Owned by somebody else. Moved at the point of a sword. But they served God in their heart. And they served him every way that they could. You don't have to be healthy to be a Christian. What can I do? If I'm laying up in a sick bed and I can't get out of bed without help, I can serve God there. In every way that I can. I don't have to be healthy and rich and young. I don't have to be old. I can serve God where I am. I think that's a great lesson, period. But it is certainly relevant to the point of this chapter. When Paul is talking about how does your marriage status affect your relationship with God. And what he would say is, in any lawful relationship where you are, you can serve God from there. And keep your vow and keep your commitment and put him first. It's going to be harder sometimes on one than the other. Circumstances may make it more difficult as a single person or as a married person. But you can serve God where you are, and that's the great encouragement. I think we've already talked about the present distress for the most part. And I've tried to share with you what I think he's talking about there. He doesn't specify, and I never have read anybody yet that could put their finger on exactly what he's talking about, but it seems distress has the idea of pressure, outside pressure and persecution. And Paul says, you're going to have to do the right thing no matter where you are in the matter, whether you're single or whether you're not. You're going to have to put God first. That's the only thing I think we have left is in the last few verses there when he's talking about those who have virgin daughters, I think particularly in verse 36. If a man think that he behaves himself uncomely toward his virgin, I think the ASV supplies the word daughter there. That's the idea, I believe. And if she pass the flower of her age and need so require, let him do what he will, he sinneth not, let them marry. Not obviously the man and his daughter, but the idea of letting his daughter marry the one whom she may fancy or that fancies her. He's not sinning as a father in that role and allowing the marriage of his children. in spite of what Paul has said about the consequences, it also may be that she's in a situation where it's better to marry than to burn. Nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but hath power over his own will, and hath so decreed in his heart that he will keep his virgin, he doeth well. So, he that giveth her in marriage doeth well, and he that giveth her not in marriage doeth better. Let's just pause there a moment. I like what the Cambridge Bible said about this passage. Here's a small quote. The advice here given is to parents in Paul's time and in most continental countries now. This was written in the 19th century. It is the parents who decide on the marriage of their children. We still have the custom of asking the father. If the father says no, that may or may not go. But anyway, it certainly had more power in the society in which Paul was writing. But Paul thinks it might, in some cases, be unseemly conduct on the part of a parent who refuses the proposal of marriage for a daughter who desires to serve God in the married state. So that's what he's talking about here. Weymouth puts it this way. If, however, a father thinks he is acting unbecomingly toward his still unmarried daughter, if she be past the bloom of her youth, and so the matter is urgent, let him do what she desires. He commits no sin. She and her suitor should be allowed to marry. So again, the idea of divine advice versus a divine law. The last two verses here deserve more time than we have to give it, but I'll offer this, and if you just totally disagree with me on any of this, please feel free to talk with me about it after service, and I'll be very happy to listen and to consider everything you say as you've been kind to consider what I'm saying. But verses 39 and 40 read this way. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. If her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, only in the Lord. However, in my opinion, she will be happier if she stays as she is. And in saying this, I think I too have God's Spirit. Several little points we'll make as we close. In the first place, I think he does make an important point about the fact that the marriage bond ends at death. And I believe that's so. You go back to Romans chapter 7, the same point seems to be made there. So, one consequence of that, I think, is that if I'm reading a passage in which I find that the consequence of a certain action is adultery, I must remember you cannot commit adultery against someone who has died. The marriage bond ends for both at death. So that's just a point to consider, and I think that has some important ramifications. Whenever I read about adultery, I know in that situation I'm reading about a person who's bound to another, and they both have to be still living. In this case, it would suggest that a person, a widow or a widower, has the right to marry again. He does make that point for clarity's sake, that a widow, a widower, is free to remarry. They both are free to remarry, to marry again. But he makes the stipulation there, in the Lord. And this is another interesting question that's been often discussed. What does he mean by in the Lord? Sometimes that expression no doubt means someone who is a Christian. And I certainly can read passages with you along that line. My own view is that I don't think that that's precisely what he's talking about here. I think rather it's more in line with what he had written in Ephesians chapter 6. You remember that phrase, children, obey your parents in the Lord. I don't think that in that passage he's saying that this is only for children who are Christians or only for children who have Christian parents. But I think the expression in the Lord modifies the obedience. It's an obedience in the Lord. It is obeying commands that are in line with the Lord's will. And I think the same would be said here as I understand it. I'll just make this point again in passing. It deserves more time, and I'd be glad to discuss this with you further. But I think it would be difficult for me to read this verse where you have a widow or a widower commanded to marry only a Christian, and then to turn around and to say, but they can stay in that relationship. And I do not believe, I think this passage we've just been reading makes it plain. God does sanctify such relationships. He does recognize such relationships. And I don't think he recognizes unlawful relationships. I got all kinds of concerns and problems when we as Christians choose as our life partner somebody who's not a child of God. I could talk about that for another hour, about how that is just the wrong way to go. It does not put the Lord first. We're not thinking about the consequences there. We're hoping things work out, and we may not be right. Granted, but I really think in this passage, what he's saying to the widow or the widower is, you have a right to marry whom you will, but always within the realm of God's will. That, I think, is what he is saying to us. You don't have the right to marry someone who's not eligible to marry, in other words. You must marry someone whom the Lord would accept as a lawful spouse. That, I think, is the point. And by the way, I think that kind of caution is needed. Even people who are older, when they're making the choice, can make mistakes as egregious as a young person can make, who has not their experience. Not in every case, but in some cases. A person coming out of a long relationship and feeling the weight of loneliness can make a disastrous decision, and in some cases even a sinful decision. So I think that caution is useful. Finally, one more point that I think we've already somewhat talked about, which is people say, what is this opinion? What are you talking about here? Is this just opinion? Is it not inspired? It is inspired. Every word is inspired. But it's inspired advice, not inspired law. I think that's maybe one way to say it. There's a difference. Paul, throughout this section, if you go back to 1 Corinthians 7, we looked in verse 6 and verse 7 there. I speak by permission and not by commandment. I would that all men were to abide even as I, but situation might change the thing. That's very different than verse 10. To the married I command. It's wrong for anybody, everybody with a lawful spouse to put away their spouse. With one exception the Lord gave. Okay. So, that I think is the difference there. What we have, Paul says, and I think I have the Spirit of Christ. You know, Paul will say, I have inspiration of God. I know what I'm talking about. But he's not giving in all of these verses commands. In some of them he's giving what we might call inspired advice, what would be better in many cases, but maybe not in every case as he has explained. Okay. Again, feel free to share your questions with me, and I'm sure there may be plenty. And I'll be glad to talk with you and listen to you about that. I hope the next time we have a chance to talk about this subject, we'll try to take on chapters 8, 9, and 10. You might say fat chance. But I'm going to try, because I think all those three chapters are so similar in thought, and they really fit as one unit, three parts of one unit. So maybe when we talk next about 1 Corinthians, we'll try to talk about that. If you want to read over those verses particularly, I'd be glad to hear your specific questions, and we'll try to deal with those as well in the text. Thank you so much for your kind attention tonight. If you're here tonight and you desire to be married to Christ, good idea. And he tells us how we come to him. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. Why not tonight? Come forward and confess your faith in Christ, and in repentance be baptized, buried in baptism, raised to walk in newness of life. Be glad to help you with that. If you're here as one who was a child of God and you've not been faithful to the Lord that you promised to serve, then please, by all means, make things right with him. Maybe we can help you in that. Let us know how. While we stand, while we sing, we ask you to come.